This is Unevenly Distributed, a podcast from Nexavize.com, where we talk to experts to find out what's next in digital technology and where it's real today.
This is Unevenly Distributed, a future tech podcast, and I'm Jeff Ilimek. And today I'm joined by Chris Lloyd-Jones, leader of the Open Technologies and Open Innovation Group at Avanade. Chris, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining. This is pretty exciting. You and I have worked together quite a bit in the past. I was thinking a lot about open source, and I was glad to get in touch with you, and we'll talk about your role in just a second. But I was looking at a couple statistics in particular and put this sort of connected it together when I heard that in recent surveys, over 90% of organizations are using open source, and over 80% of those have cited innovation and how open source accelerates innovation as a key reason for that. So that's really what I wanted to drill down on, is the connection between future and innovation and new ways of doing work and new ways of making digital solutions, and how open source is feeding into that. And I thought of you immediately. You've got that title, Open Technologies and Open Innovation. There's lots of opens in there. And it's a relatively new organization role inside of Avanade. Why don't we start there and you introduce that just a little bit, and we can talk about open source after that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good place to start. As you said, there's a lot of opens in the title. And I think the one that I am most excited about is open source. So that's things like open data, open software, open hardware. And for me, it's all about collaboration. Traditionally, I think we've thought about in-sourcing, we've thought about outsourcing, but I don't think companies have focused as much on open sourcing. And yeah, there's been a lot of changes in the market there. We've seen a lot of organizations get deeply involved, but I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, excellent. So, I mean, why don't we break that down a little bit about what some of those definitions are and how it's gotten to this point? You talked about a few things, which I think it's interesting to define for people. Open data, open systems, open beyond just what we traditionally would think of when we think of open source. So what is open data? What is inner source? Let's go back and forth on that a little bit and get those terms out on the table.
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of this has a very storied history, a very lengthy history. I know when I was still learning computer science, when I was training over the years, people used to talk about free software. That was free as in beer. And I think initially it was very much the Free Software Foundation, the FSF, founded in 1985, that holds and started a lot of the GNU license. And that was really where people were at. They thought about free, and they didn't really talk about open as much. They talked about the idea of computers and the software that ran on them being free and being freely available and unencumbered. Open source, I think, is the maturing of that definition. So what it really means is that the software is open for organizations to use, open for people to contribute to. And there's a number of organizations that have taken that free as in beer definition and overlaid it and made it a little bit more relevant. So the main organization I go to is the Open Source Initiative, the OSI. They have what is the de facto standard really for open source. And they have 10 things that something has to meet to be open source. So the code or the hardware or the data must be freely redistributed. The program must include any source code that was used to create it. You must be able to derive and create new works. You must maintain integrity, the author's source code, attribution, credit. That's all a part of why people do these things. You can't discriminate against people or groups, so this must be open to everyone. You can't discriminate into fields of endeavor or industry. You must share that same license. Your license cannot be specific to your product. So you can't make the Jeff Ilimek license and kind of go, oh no, only I can use this. You can't restrict other software, and you must be tech neutral. So really, open is about making industry and society available for others to collaborate with. And I think free as in software before actually led a lot of companies to lock out others. That's open source, I guess.
Yeah, interesting. That's a very complete definition, and I really like that. OSI laying out those 10 principles, I think, is a really good way to think about it. There's probably other looser definitions that sit around on the fringe, but that would really be the agreed upon core, I think, for most anyone who participates in open source. I think a key bit of differentiation in there that's a bit of clarity is that it's not locked into a particular license. And there are a few licenses that work out there, but in order for it to really be considered open source, it needs to abide by those principles.
Yeah, and I've written a couple of blogs about this and business models, and I think depending on whether or not you're, say, a university or a college, or if you're a for-profit company or a charity, you might pick a different license that might meet your aims more or less. For example, you might restrict the ability for competitors to run cloud services and yet make your software freely available. You might want to change quite how people attribute authors. But broadly speaking, there's a list of off-the-shelf licenses that you can pick from that are all open. And there are other organizations that work with the open source initiative, like the Open Data Institute, who then take that same definition and apply it to data, or they apply it to hardware, like the Open Compute Project. But I think open these days is really about removing barriers to other people taking part.
Let's talk about those other two you mentioned, because I think that's where it starts to expand and get a little interesting. Open data, open hardware. That's where you need to expand your mind just a bit. I think open data, data sets, data out there on the web. Give me some examples of that people can sort of wrap their minds around when they think about open.
So I'm really excited about all these organizations, although the fact that open is in the name does mean that we talk about a lot of opens. The Open Source Initiative, the Open Data Institute, the Open Compute Project. I'm also part of Open UK, and I've worked with Open Forum Europe. The idea behind these organizations is they're removing barriers. So the Open Data Institute is defining what an open data set is. So how you can take data and remix it and make it available to people. So a good example of that might be the vehicle accidents that might have happened on a particular road in a particular country. You might want to look at that. You have citizen data wranglers and citizen journalists thinking, how can we make our roads safer? There are open data sets around food facts. So if you're eating a particular brand of cereal or drinking a particular drink, you know how many carbs are in there, how many calories. Most of this data is about the stuff that we interact with in our day-to-day lives. So why lock it behind a paywall? If you give people access to the data, the theory goes, we can do better things with it.
One of the things that comes to mind when I think about open data is a lot of the discussion around data and how we think about data has transitioned over the course of the last, say, 10 years, 20 years, many decades. We've been dealing with data privacy and data lockdown and data protection and protecting personal information that may be revealed even through data sets which seem anonymized. How is open data and open data initiatives dealing with that? And what do they think about in those terms when you could say, here's an open data set about vehicle crash data, but if that is traceable in any way to individuals, that would seem problematic. So where does that figure in, either in principles or in just side unintended consequences or effects that people need to deal with?
It's an interesting one, and it's definitely something that's been thought of. I would say it falls less in the principles and more in the process that the Open Data Institute talks about. So they're very hot on, they're very focused on making sure that consent is obtained for any data sets that involve real people. That where data relates to maybe that operational instances of a crash, you might genericize it in some way that you can't identify the initial person who was in a crash. It's all about making the data usable for the purposes for which it's intended. So if you don't need individually identifying characteristics, you strip them out. So there is a fine line there, I think, that balance between individual privacy versus the ability to actually make sense of the world around us. Like mapping data, for example, you go on Google Maps, people's faces are blurred out, but the data sets are generally usable, even though they might not be open data in that sense.
Yeah. I really love the idea of open data, and I wish more data was available to be opened and or even even closed, just not so locked behind too many barriers, because especially with the advances in data science, the kind of information and value that we can build into understanding new disciplines in all industries, healthcare is a great one. the more data that we can get to understand outcomes for people of different socioeconomic and regional and health behavior backgrounds by gathering disparate data sets together is amazing. However, so much of that seems to be getting locked down more and more. From a privacy perspective, it's problematic. So it's good that these initiatives are out there to try to anonymize and open it. The other corollary, though, there that I'm interested in your perspective on is data as currency and the value of data. And there's been a huge transition over the past 10 years, 15 years to understanding that data is money. I would expect that would be a big barrier to data becoming open as well, because either organizations understanding the value of their data are going to want to keep it close because they're commercial entities and this is a very valuable asset, or they're going to want people to pay for it. So even if they want to allow it to be out there, they're not going to want it to be open. They're going to want it to be for a fee. So where's that at? Where's that get connected?
That really excites me. And the reason I find that interesting is because I'm actually seeing a really big tension between that open and closed data sets, more so than I'd say in software. Open data is a slightly newer concept. And I was speaking actually with a friend the other day, and these are the types of things I do when I'm sat in the cinema waiting for a film to start, texting my friend, voice noting, because I've been working in some university studies recently around work, and I've noticed that I'd come across concepts in the European academic literature that might be the same concepts but by another name in the American academic literature. There might be the same concepts by another name in, again, repeat it. And because a lot of the academic research these days is funded by companies and organizations in private, public, commercial partnerships, it tends to be locked behind paywalls. So I actually think that I don't have a solution for this, but I think you've cottoned onto something there. With the idea of data as currency, people are trying to hoard that currency, which I think might be starting to limit scientific progress, processes, because we just don't know what's happening. I'll give you a concrete example. Quantum supremacy. A couple of years ago, IBM was announcing it, Google was announcing it, and I think 1-2 years down the line, a number of open source organizations refuted both of those claims and went, no, you actually haven't hit quantum supremacy just yet. But it took 2 years because all of the data, all of the academic proofs around how to make a quantum computer had been locked behind that paywall because it was their currency. So actually, science could even be slowed down by this data as currency.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think it's a shame if we can get more big organizations, and we'll talk about big organizations making steps in this direction and what might incent them to do that. But if we can get more big organizations to think that way, or to provide even commercial incentives in somehow wrapped around it in the same way that for open source software, there are commercial models where you're supporting on top of it and around it that make it viable for commercial organizations to adopt open source models, that would be great, because you can get such better outcomes from a society perspective, and we live in a society, from a society perspective, when you put these data sets together. And the more data, because of the advances in data science, the more data we have from the more sources, the more better conclusions that we can, or insights that we can gain. Now, the third one that you mentioned, which I'm even more fuzzy on, is open hardware. And I've read about open hardware for a number of years now. I don't think it was all that prevalent probably until about 5, 6, 7 years ago. Define open hardware and give me some examples where somebody's actually doing something with open hardware.
Okay, cool. I think if I'm going to talk about open hardware, I should probably step back and answer another part of one of your earlier questions, like what is insourcing, what is outsourcing? I think outsourcing is broadly understood, but for those that may not know, it's about taking a business process generally that might not be part of your core business and having someone else do that who can do it at scale more efficiently, such as accountancy or invoicing. Insourcing is kind of that middle ground between open source and outsource. It's about kind of going, this is core to my business, let's develop it internally. And the reason I mention that is because traditionally hardware was core to people's businesses. So you had Google with these massive data centers, starting off with desktop computers they were then stripping out for parts and swapping them when they started up Google, like shortly after the turn of the century. And, their secret sauce then was, we're the best people at taking commodity hardware and stitching together into data centers. That would be insourcing. Open sourcing and open hardware, and a real example would be the Open Compute Project. The idea that we can make a blueprint for a data center, that we'd share that with others to solve a common problem. And those problems are limited supply chains. With COVID, with the economic crises we're now looking at around the world, how can we make it cheaper and easier to replace just the parts that failed? And I guess closer to my heart, with sustainability, how can we make data centers that use less power and less parts so that they're easier for people to replace, to keep alive for longer, to reduce the amount of resources we're using and create a circular economy? So the Open Compute Project is a great example of a project that takes open hardware and makes the ability for you to create a data center and other things they're looking at down the road.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And it makes sense to me that the type of organization that would need to champion the open hardware initiative or an open hardware specification and do that sharing would have to be some sort of consortium. It would have to be some sort of group where multiple organizations are coming together to forward a common goal. And because multiple organizations are working together, in some ways, maybe it's even easier than trying to come up with a bunch of legal agreements and this sort of friction between all of them as they're putting their IP together into a project. Let's make it open source. That way it ensures that both the information that we're putting in, we get value back out because we're ensured an open product for whatever it ultimately becomes.
Yeah, and that's one of the great things about open source in general. You're not adding barriers. You're not anti-competitive because any other company can come along and look at what you've made, pick it up off the shelf and take it forward. Whereas these cartels behind closed doors in the past were anti-progress because, like you say, we're all behind paywalls at that point and you can't move things forward.
Yeah. And in a partnership where multiple organizations are contributing, well, then there's a clear incentive, there's a clear value. Yes, I will also then contribute because I'm going to get the benefit of my 3 partners who are also going to be contributing, and I will get their code and resources and output as a result. Another place I've seen that happening is 5G. And 5G is going through from some of their consortiums trying to open source some of the hardware for the mechs, the control towers that are running the little 5G cells. Because if it's an open hardware specification, that makes it easier for multiple companies to jump in. We need a broad proliferation of hardware and hardware vendors and support and people doing operations on these things. So the more we can get it out there, the better. So organizations that have a stake in 5G proliferation, like the carriers, like the hyperscalers, like Microsoft, like Google, they're willing to then contribute to an initiative for the open hardware that will then get it out there so that it will hopefully be the platform that they can build on top of.
I was going to say it's interesting because I can see how there's also a disincentive for open source. Not everyone's bought in there. And if you look at a lot of the big telecom companies and mobile providers, a lot of them made their money and have their business on patents. And obviously patents and open source, there's a large tension there with, phenomena like patent trolling and competition in that space. So I still think it's a bit of a mindset shift for these organizations to swap from patenting to open hardware. And we're still seeing that play through in the market.
The organizations that are building the actual hardware, they're probably in that state where they're sensing some friction or they do have to have a mindset change. For a hyperscaler like Microsoft, who's not building the hardware, they're probably all for it. So you're right. There is probably an issue there at the level of because of that patent, that not patent trolling necessarily, but the patent defense, which has created a framework for partnerships in the past. And the way that has worked is you have some patents, I have some patents. And because we both have sets of patents that each other wants, now we have a legal framework to be able to create a fair partnership. And because we can trade and you're not going to steal my stuff because you have stuff that you're protecting as well.
Yeah, and you even see actually patents being used to protect open source. So the CEO of Open UK actually formally ran the Open Invention Network, a collection of patents that organizations such as Microsoft, such as other large organizations could join, contribute their patents or at least licenses to those, and go, if someone tries to sue you for your patents, you have access to mine, group them together, and therefore we can protect this open source body of work. It wasn't necessarily intended for open source, but certainly we're seeing it being used in that way, protecting innovation.
That's really interesting. It's sort of a joint communal pool of patents then that can be used to somewhat indemnify the open source organization so that they don't get sued by these other commercial entities that have their patent portfolios. And in the same way that IBM and Microsoft and Google, in small cases, but only fringe cases, aren't suing each other constantly because they all have big patent portfolios that are sort of their nuclear arsenal. And if you sue me big, I'll just sue you right back. So then you can't. But an open source consortium needs those patents on their side then also so that they've got those just as a defensive mechanism. Not that they're going to go out and pursue or become patent trolls based on it, but it becomes a defensive resource. That makes sense to me.
And it means that even the smallest player has access to that same nuclear arsenal as well.
Right. Anyone who's contributing, no matter how small, is somewhat indemnified as being part of that organization.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. Okay, so now we get to open source and innovation. So we know that open source is a tool that people can use to run their business. We've got some of the biggest examples that have been used for the longest, like Linux, that's pretty well understood. How is open source going to drive innovation in your view? And then what are some of the challenges? And I think this still gets to a dovetail on some of the things that we're talking about of, I'm going to share my secrets. Where's the incentive then if all of the things that I'm doing to invent new things, even though innovation is not invention, but is being opened to all of my partners or competitors? So open source driving innovation, Let's start there, and then we'll get into those challenges.
Yeah, I think some of the positives that you can see is the ability for organizations to really focus on what matters to them. I don't mean that in a wishy-washy way. I mean, you have to have culture, and that's something we can probably drill down into. But I think the example that we've talked about in the past is Legend from Finos. Finos is one of the many tentacled project arms of the Linux Foundation. It's an organization or a foundation focused on financial services. And you think about these large entities, and I guess let's touch on some of the problems they might have. They have regulators who want regulation to be implemented. They have very similar challenges, like how do I get data from the ground up to the C-suite? How do I share what's going on in the business? But these challenges are the same, even if the value they're trying to generate might be different through their investment algorithms or processes. They all want a data platform, even though they don't want to share maybe what it is that they're investing or what data it is that they are trading or looking at. So Legend has a ton of large organizations, so I believe Credit Suisse, JP Morgan, I think Goldman Sachs, so I'd have to check that one, who've effectively gone, well, hang on a second. If we all open source our data platform, Legend, we can put it out there in the open domain. So we're not anti-competitive. Anyone can use it. We can confirm to regulators that we've met their needs and meet them once because they can see it and answer all of our questions in one go. We can then each have one or two people collaborate and keep this platform alive. And therefore, we can actually focus on what we do best, generating value for our shareholders in our investment strategies, and not what isn't our core business, being a data platform tech company. And I think that's a great large-scale example, but there's tons of others, like in the healthcare space during COVID, for example.
Regulatory was an aspect of that I didn't think of right away, and I think is probably really, really important. Off the top of my head, I can already imagine the regulatory environment, especially in financial services, one, healthcare would be another huge one, where I would think if organizations can come together and break down regulatory barriers in a positive way, join together so that they can meet regulatory compliance more quickly and easily through open source initiatives, that's got to be huge value to all of them.
It's incredible. It means they're not all speaking to a separate person of these regulators and meeting it 10 different ways. Because a lot of these regulations and laws, they're not machine readable. Often they have an "it depends" answer. And if "it depends," it means you can interpret them different ways. The regulator can almost be a part of the conversation. There's actually another open source group called the Alliance, I think, for Innovative Regulation that has regulators like the FCA, the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. I think it's got the SEC in it as well. And they can actually go, if you use this product, we can answer your questions in one go because we're out in the open, and therefore we don't have that same privacy burden.
That's interesting. And in that way, it can accelerate the innovation in business and in technique and in investment strategy, because now I don't have to be spending that chunk of my time or my budget or my people focused on that regulatory action. And that's not repeated 50 times across the industry because we're all using this same platform.
Think about talent as well. When we're trying to hire people, if someone wants to get into financial services, in the past, these, let's call them legacy systems, were behind closed doors. Now you can go out there, start contributing, and apply to one of these large firms and actually go, no, I've got experience of this system that you guys maintain, and I'm a big part of it. So what makes me really happy, because on the face of it, it could look like job loss, because actually you're limiting the number of people who can go after your platform. But it's job creation and making it easier for people to move and get involved and join the industry, making it easier for startups to pick up these platforms, they have access to the same resources. I think it's just net positive for society.
While we're on that topic, it makes me think of something which is potential downside, which would be, do you see the potential for these open source platforms, if they become too pervasive, too set as the core of an industry, to limit innovation? If everyone's just using Legend, I think about this in healthcare, and it's not open, but there's Epic and Cerner. So all medical records are either Epic or Cerner, and that's just how it's done. And in that way, because there's that duopoly to some degree, the incentive for Epic and Cerner to innovate is somewhat less. And there is valid criticism that those medical record systems are not as useful and advanced as they could be. If we're all on Legend and we're all financial services and are just on Legend, and Legend gets set today, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, if we're just still using Legend and Legend just sits out there, is that going to be an inhibitor to innovation because you don't have people going off and trying and doing new interesting things?
I think that is something we'd have to focus on. I would say right now I'm not seeing that happen. I could see how we could get to that state. But I think the nice thing about open source is if you have a disagreement, you can fork it and go off on your own. Or there's so many components now, there's a very low barrier to stitching together alternative solutions. So you look at the front end space where we have React, we have Angular, we have Vue, and every so often someone comes along with an alternative. Alpine.js now is going the other way, almost very lightweight sprinkling of JavaScript and HTML rather than a big framework. So yes, I'd say that could happen. What worries me more is the burden on maintainers of projects that are much more highly adopted than, say, Legend, but have far fewer people power. The one that very commonly gets cited, and I can't take credit for this example, but I think it's a good one, is Express. Express is one of the largest web servers for Node.js, so the server for running JavaScript applications on the server side. Now, I believe that's one maintainer who in the past has had all kinds of issues raised on GitHub, has had security concerns identified, has had, I believe, almost false positives and vulnerabilities from security researchers trying to make a name. Now, if this one person gets burnt out and stops maintaining Express, all these other applications then have to move to another platform. It opens up the opportunity for someone that might be tired. And I'm not saying this maintainer is, but for security holes to slip through the net, for example. And I worry that when something is open, when we think of it as free, we often don't see the humans behind this, the very small group who do this for passion, who can easily be put off in the way that when they are paid a fair wage, they don't have that because it's their day job.
So what do we do as contributors to open source, as open source organizations and consortiums, to incent the participation and get, how do we get this one maintainer some help so that they aren't all alone especially since it's such a critical component, potentially, of a broad array of solutions. Is there anything creative that people, I mean, I know we're getting grants and investment from some major organizations. Is that the direction to go? Is prestige enough? Where does that happen to get people involved on the back end?
I think in the same way that people have different motivations, from a desire to be fiscally comfortable, so that would be money, to the prestige of being seen to do something, or for altruism to give back. There isn't really one answer that fits all because people are different. There's a number of different answers. So on the money side, as well as grants, we have GitHub sponsors, for example. I quite like that one because I feel like it gives a direct connection between a project that I use and paying a very small amount that comes to a cup of coffee to kind of go, you did a good job. There's a prestige element there, and there's a money element, and then it adds up. Then you have projects like Chaos from the Linux Foundation, which is community health analytics, looking at diversity and inclusion, starting to look at the age profiles, demographics, making sure that there is a fair and diverse community contributing to these things. I think there are some more things we should consider. I mean, what is succession planning in an open source community? At what point does someone start to think, I'm bored, I might step down? I don't think open source has a good answer for that yet. It tends to be, okay, bye, switch off, I'm done. Whereas actually, I think having a way for someone to put their hand up and go, I'd love to take part, would be a good one.
That is interesting. There's not necessarily a governing body which is assisting with that, which is assisting with the organizational aspects of the people contributing or working, or in any of the ways that kind of HR would potentially be useful. Making sure that people don't get overloaded, making sure that people have some sort of path to be recognized, making sure that people are compensated in some way, whatever, monetary or not. In some of the bigger consortiums, potentially there's an opportunity and a framework for that happening. In some of these side projects that aren't part of any particular consortium or organization that's governing them, it's probably very difficult and be a hard problem to solve.
My caveat to that would be, I'd say that open source organizations are very good at identifying problems and self-solving in an ad hoc way. And when a problem is solved, it spreads rapidly like wildfire, but in a good way. I think contribution files are one such example. The name might sound mundane, but there's a couple of standards that open source has settled on. The ethical source covenant is one. It's a set of standards for how you shouldn't be discriminatory, how you should be fair, how you should respect others. And one organization settled on that, and it spread. Standards for how you write documentation, the use of Markdown, how to get involved. So I do think that if one organization does this really well, or a couple, those practices spread, because these communities, I'd say, are actually incredibly diverse compared to the way in which they used to be, which is odd to say as here two white guys speaking to each other. But I work with a very diverse community at the Green Software Foundation, for example. So if we can solve it, or if anyone else can solve it, those communities speak to each other and will share those practices.
I want to talk about green software in just a second, but right before we do that, just to leave off on this, that people contributing, incentive for individuals to contribute, larger organizations getting involved as well. They have incentives depending on the way they work. Avanade. So Avanade is a big global systems integrator. It's a big consulting company. It doesn't necessarily have a stake in a 5G network. It doesn't have a stake in a particular industry where they have a regulatory barrier that they need to overcome. Why is Avanade, and why do you exist, Chris? Not to justify yourself, but why does Avanade investing one of the most brilliant people in Avanade to go off and think about this and do this? And what does Avanade as a commercial entity expect to sort of get out of it?
Well, first of all, I appreciate and I'll take the compliment. But to answer the question, there's a few different things. So I think there's, going back to the reasons why people might do open source to create projects, there's talent attraction. There's a skills shortage for a lot of the things in which we want to do day to day, from designers to software engineers. If we are involved in open source and we look like a good place to work, and we are a good place to work, people can actually see the way in which we work by our contributions to open source. It opens us up. We're not impenetrable. That's one thing. We could hire someone who knows React, because we see they've developed React on their CV, but we need to be a part of those communities to be part of the conversation. I guess there's brand awareness. By Avanade being involved in these communities, then people can actually see that Avanade knows these technologies. We're a great strategy business, but we're also a great consulting and tech business. I've worked with Confidential Ledger and SQL Ledger from Microsoft. We've had people approach us because they've seen our work, which isn't something I'd necessarily expected. But there's a cultural attraction piece there as well. And I think we've got a really big focus on responsible business as well. So we talked earlier about the challenges of open source. Another one of my colleagues, can't take credit, Chris Lloyd-Jones, was talking about open source as a common good. And this is one way to treat open source as a digital common good, and make sure that by us being involved, we're giving back money, we're giving back financial support, and we're giving people time to keep the projects we rely on alive. I think the final piece of it is it's the future way of doing things. I look at new technologies like Dapper, the Distributed Application Platform Runtime. Microsoft created it. They donated it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Avanade is part of CNCF. If we are in the technical steering committees, we can actually, help to set the direction in collaboration with friends and competitors, and we can better advise our clients. So we build cultural capital. So I guess that's talent, that's brand awareness, that's cultural capital, and it's also about being responsible because it's the society we live in.
That makes sense. And hopefully that's inspiring to other organizations like Avanade that are, especially consultancies, to go ahead and get involved. One of the things that these large global systems integrators and consultancies are not is they're not product companies. So locking in their IP necessarily isn't necessarily a competitive advantage. There's not a lot of that kind of IP that really gets used in the long term. They're not creating and maintaining a product. Some are. There's some frameworks, and there's some reuse of interesting projects. There's protection of customer projects and products, which is a separate. So that stuff's not being contributed, obviously. But that incentive of, if we have this vibrant source of solutions wrapped around the platforms where we engage, and we have expertise, that's where a systems integrator makes their money, is applying that expertise out to business communities. It's the services. And if we go back to the 90s, when open source was sort of really first coming to fruition, the big conversation about free as in beer versus free as in ideas, speech, free as in speech versus free as in beer, and how would people going to make money? Why would Microsoft ever get involved in open source? Because software needs to be sold for developers to make money. The idea was you don't have to make money on the code itself, on the product. You make money around the services around it, deploying it, maintaining it. There's 10 times as much work and effort and money that gets spent around a license versus any particular license that gets purchased. So that makes a ton of sense, I would think, to an organization like Avanade. If there are these good things within the domains where Avanade provides value, that's really good. And then on top of that, which is huge right now, is talent acquisition, talent retention. These are really interesting things. This is something real that gets out there into the world, and it's not just a departmental solution for one particular company that you do and you get off of and you never see again. That can be very exciting.
Yeah.
So that's
I
excellent.
think Liquid is a good example of that. Liquid is on our GitHub. It's got, I think, 400 odd stars at this point. And the idea is relatively simple. It's an abstraction to deploy APIs on many different hyperscaler clouds. But why do we need to solve that for every single client that we go to? We don't. I mean, if we don't make it, someone else will. It's not a massive solution, but we open sourced it. And now from the number of stars, the community of non-Avanaders around it, people actually see we're giving back. So I think that's one example I'd give.
And from my experience in services organizations for many decades, it's very difficult for a services organization that is not a product organization to maintain those things over time. And if you can get it out there as an open source product and it solves a particular problem for you, and you can get friends to come in and help maintain it and productize it and create that solution and evolve it over time. That seems like that should be very exciting for a services organization as well. Now, I know
I agree with
you
that.
in particular are involved in a couple other things that are sort of like the lighthouse examples of open source contribution, green software, and some of the work going on there. Why don't you talk about that? We talked about some of it with Six in our interview about sustainability, but talk about that open aspect of it and the work you're doing there.
Sure. So aside from my day-to-day with Avanade, I'm involved in a couple of things. So one, I run the Open UK EV Charging Blueprint. And two, most excitingly, for this conversation, I chair the open source working group at the Green Software Foundation. The Green Software Foundation was set up just over a year ago to, at that time, create an ecosystem of people, standards, and tooling which reduce the carbon of our software. And our vision is newly updated, actually, to create an ecosystem to make sure the software has zero negative environmental effects. And I'll give some examples. Six probably touched on the fact that software emits a crazy amount of carbon indirectly because of the way in which electricity is generated. And what we're doing is creating the tooling so that developers can remain productive, but not create those problems again. So one of these is the Carbon Aware Software Development Kit. That's a project where you can instrument your applications and your code to measure the impact of your code and run your software at a time when the energy grid is green and not when it is dirty. So, for example, if you're reconciling invoices, an example I gave earlier, or if you're waiting to bill people, maybe at 2 a.m. the energy grid's really dirty, at 4 or 5 in the morning it's clean. So you defer when you process. So that's one quite powerful job. Again, it's open source. Let's not reinvent it every single time, particularly because storage itself has a cost. Let's solve this and altruistically share it to make it better for the world.
And the incentive there is Avanade, as a core principle of the organization, is looking at being a responsible citizen. And it's looking at joining and partnering with Accenture and Microsoft directly, and then a whole bunch of others indirectly on sustainability, global sustainability initiatives. This is an ideal way, a key way that Avanade, based on the things that Avanade is very good at, can contribute back, can make an impact. Avanade is not going to be running water treatment in sub-Saharan Africa, but they can do this. So this sort of fulfills that part of their bargain in saying we are interested in sustainability, and it better than just lip service or just donating some money to a foundation. Work and expertise can go into creating these kinds of frameworks, and this SDK in particular that says, hey, we know that this is potentially a problem. We know that inefficient compute is a problem. And at the very extreme end, when you think of something like crypto, there's lots of headlines all over the place that say that this kind of computing can grow into a big problem. This is how we're making a difference. And all of both the personal pride of the organization, the achievement of some of those goals, but also then attracting talent, because people want to be part of organizations that are doing the right thing, that are thinking about the right things, that are making a difference. That all tends to then come together very quickly.
I think it's also a great, as well as for the organization, it's for the people. By being part of the organization, we provide these opportunities for our people to take part in some of these things above and beyond the client work they have day to day, to have that link to something ongoing and constant. And I talked about the SDK. Another one is the Carbon Aware pipeline. So as you develop software and you deploy it, you might have infrastructure as code. You define the servers in which you want code to run. And actually, you can see when you add services, you increase the carbon burden. So making that something you can measure and report on and show that over time your carbon has gone up or down. I think a good example of how the organization might sponsor and join, but everyone, not just one privileged little bit of the organization I happen to be in, can take part, is that someone close to you, Nick, for example, is very, very much a part of the Carbon Aware SDK.
Yep.
So everyone is available to everyone to take part in.
Right. Nick, that's Nick, my son, for listeners who might not know. who is
Yeah.
also is currently at Avanade, doing work on these kinds of initiatives, which is amazing. Okay. Innovation leads us to think about the future. Let's look a little bit into the future, out 3, 5, 10 years, second wave, third wave, kinds of thinking. Where do you see open source potentially going to drive innovation or be a key element of innovation across the kinds of things we're excited about for the future of digital services and computing? Any top ones come to mind? I'm sort of springing it on you, but
Yeah, no. Some top ones do come to mind. If I think about the three opens and I start with open source, for me, that's going to be the democratization of source itself. So it means that if someone wants to create, I don't know, a tool to check in umbrellas in and out of the office, they don't have to be a dev to do so. They can be a pro coder, a low coder, or no coder and share their solutions. So the barriers to creating software come down, making it much easier to visually code, for example, and share that. Because a lot of these low code, no code solutions actually don't provide the integration with these open source sharing communities. So in Zapier or if this then that, you might be able to share templates, but I really don't think we're at the same level of sophistication. But I realized you wanted something slightly more society changing. So I think coming on to open data and open hardware, I'm really excited about the democratization of real production. So if I want to say a vase or one of these signs that I've got behind me, you can see the video at all. If I want to share that, I can actually share my 3D printing file. I can make not just the plastics printable, but the chips, the metals, the power sources. But then going back into circular economy, because we have limited resources on this one planet, making the ability to recycle that product. So I share my ideas. They live in the real world for as long as they need to, and then they go back. That was a bit pie in the sky.
I like it.
And then I think open data. Yeah. So it's source. There's the hardware, so the physical, I guess, open physical could be in the future. And the final open data is open policy making. So we've seen the World Health Organization has an open source projects office now. The UN has one. The US federal government's looking at one and has code.gov. The EU is looking at one. I think policymakers don't think of themselves as being in this space to collaborate. We all have very similar challenges. And at the height of the COVID pandemic, we had cities sharing tools for tracking COVID with other nation states on the other side of the world. Imagine if we solved problems for digital ethics, if we solved the way in which we have environmental standards through collaboration that anyone can input into the ultimate citizen democracy. That's where I'm at. All the positives. Yeah.
No, that's excellent. On the one, as you described, the manufacturing and production, the idea of on-demand custom manufacturing, being able to do that through open source, so that I think that's a big driver towards getting to reduced consumption across the planet and across society. If only the product that I want when I want it is what's produced, because I have access to lots of different parts and lots of different open systems and hardware and schematics and the design of the output of the product that I can even customize to my particular need, it's going to be a more useful product to me. It's going to be more interesting to me, but it'll also avoid the situation where I, as a product producer, need to just produce. If you build it, they will come. Produce a warehouse full of products that I'm hoping people are going to buy, which tends to generate lots and lots of waste. And those products that I produce probably don't individually achieve as much of their purpose as they could, because they're all designed relatively generically or to a lowest common denominator. So that does seem amazing. Building recyclability and sustainability into the designs and being able to, because they're open, review them from that perspective. That also sounds like it gets really, really interesting.
Yeah, think about clutter that people might have around the house. So I've got a tent that I keep year round for if I'm going hiking, or I've got screwdrivers. It even lends itself to minimalism, just having the item physically exist for when you need it and recycling it when you don't. I think that's more powerful than it might seem, because actually we probably don't need as much space if there's not all these things hanging around all the time.
I need a PLA grinder so that I can print random things and then grind the PLA back into pellets, which you can do, and then reprint the next thing that I want and just have a big circular economy of random things and stuff in my house that doesn't expand and doesn't fill up landfills. That would be great. And you can get there to some degree.
And for everyone.
Right. One place that I've been a little bit concerned lately, and concerned and also just disappointed, is artificial intelligence, machine learning. Some of the best models, some of the best innovation in that space that we've talked about on the last couple episodes is either locked behind paywalls or locked behind organizations' IP. It's some of it's very available. GPT-3 and DALL-E is trying to be very available, but it's not open. And then you got something like Midjourney, which is an example of a DALL-E type image generation platform and solution, which immediately went to a for-fee model. You can experiment with a little bit. You get like 10 images, 10 queries. You can mess around with it. And beyond that, you have to pay. That's fine at the beginning of when we started to when we exited the last AI winter and we had this proliferation of research around artificial intelligence. All of the models, all of the understanding, all the research was very open and being shared. I feel like with GPT-3, DALL-E, Midjourney, when we're getting these really complex, interesting new models, it's closing back up, and that's disappointing to me. What's your perspective there? Do you see that as well? Is there some way we can halt that? What do we do to keep it still open?
It's an odd one because I'm very torn. I oscillate back and forth on where I sit on this. I mean, in general, my default position is everything should be open. But sometimes I hear these organizations say, okay, but we're closed because we want to be responsible. We want to put content policies in place, like look at DALL-E limiting the ability to generate indecent images or images about people that really exist.
Right.
But then I come back to the other side and I kind of go, well, yeah, but if you're policing that, we're not creating societal mechanisms to do these things because you're kind of like our parents. How are we learning? And that worries me because you gave the example of DALL-E. There's a second one you cited there. I noticed yesterday a fully open source DALL-E competitor went online on GitHub, and the code's now been released. Now, if the others were open source, we might have started to think of mechanisms for inoculating the way in which we read Twitter, or we look at TV to look for manufactured images, maybe certifying them from the camera all the way through to production. But we don't have that. We're not used to thinking about the fact that anything we see or hear or read could be manufactured. So I guess it's a long, rambly way of saying I think they should be open, but I think that, again, policymakers, the media, technology companies need to actually be talking more about this. And we shouldn't be expecting technology companies to be gatekeepers, particularly because I feel like in all of our societies, we have very different ethics and very different ways of seeing the world. And one company on the US West Coast might not realistically have the same values as another company in Asia or in Europe or in Australasia.
Right. And I'll agree. It's a difficult problem. You also have the level of skill needed to create some of these models and these solutions, the AI research going in is very, very expensive. So it is very difficult then to have sort of that back end incentive as well to say, well, it's good for society. Why don't you spend $1 billion and just let it be out there? Okay. I want to be a good citizen, but billion dollars, that's a little bit rough.
Yeah.
So quantum, this very high end AI ML type research, it does get difficult. The places where hopefully, as you said, as the techniques get more understood, maybe they can keep their best version in a box and license that out and make that available to people. But the research and the knowledge, if that can be opened up, that's a way for that to move forward. And I think maybe, as you said, if there's another organization that said, okay, I kind of understand what they're doing here, we'll create a version, standing on the shoulders of giants, but we'll create an open source, maybe slightly less functional, maybe slightly less useful, but we'll create an open source model of that people can then think about and innovate on top of. Maybe that's the way to go.
Well, it's probably very naive, but playing devil's advocate, I haven't yet seen an organization make $1 billion bet and open source it. So I don't know that we know what would happen. And yeah, that probably sounds naive. But you look at WhatsApp. WhatsApp started off as, in the UK at least, 79 pence per year you'd pay. Then Facebook acquired them. So now they're part of the much larger Meta organization. The person that founded WhatsApp went on to found Signal. And you've got competing standards like Matrix. And Signal manages now to exist as a totally open sourced, not-for-profit standard that is still making him a good salary. It's still able to make him more than enough to live on, and yet it's funded through charitable donations. And again, I give the equivalent of $1 every so often or a small tip. I mean, you might not end up with as many billionaires off the back of it, but I don't know that you'd necessarily end up in a net loss. But who knows? I guess it's too early to say.
Right. Well, this has been awesome. These are great concepts. In fact, I'm sad that we're at the end of our time because now I want to start going off and going down some of these rabbit holes. So we're going to have to postpone that and come back and have a round 2 to talk about some of those. I would like to talk about that whole monetization model of the future and how we could get to a society that rewards value output and not just ownership of capital. I'm a capitalist. I love it. But we have to operate within that model today. So we're creating billionaires not because that they're extracting value from us, but because of the ownership of ideas. And as those ideas grow, it's creating value. So there's the preview for where I want to talk about that, but alternate models or parallel models that can maybe solve that in a more society available way.
Bring me back for stakeholder capitalism, ethical capitalism, and I'm here.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, excellent. So that stakeholder is a great concept. Okay, we'll leave it there. This has been great. I'm more excited than ever about open source, and I'm really excited that we've got big thinkers like you on board and driving both initiatives and inside of Avanade. I think that's really healthy for the organization. So thank you very much, Chris, and I hope we can have another conversation soon.
Thanks, Jeff. Speak soon. Ciao.
This has been a Nexavize production. For video, links, and to support the show, please visit nexavize.com. That's NEXAVISE.com.